they would secure in the hands of Israel their political future, their military future, and they would accept that the Jordan River is actually the border of Israel, the natural border of Israel. The other model of the prison is that should the Palestinians resist this idea, the open prison would turn into a highly secured prison, where the wardens would be allowed to use collective punitive disciplinary measures to keep them in place. And this cruel and callous formula, as you know, developed year by year. On the one hand, you had Palestinians' resistance to this reality, and on the other hand, you had an Israeli reaction to this Palestinian resistance. And the reaction was harsh, and then the Palestinian resistance became harsher, and then the reaction became even harsher. And the inventive mind of the wardens, if you want, of the prison, was endless. They found various ways of trying to send a message to the Palestinians that any individual act would immediately be met by collective punishment. But there was more to life under occupation, as you know, than just these two mega prison ideas. Two additional elements were decided upon already then in June 1967. One is that quite a few of the areas of the West Bank are not part of the mega prison. They should be directly annexed to Israel. There were two ways of annexing areas in the Palestinian territories to Israel. One was direct annexation, as had been done in the Greater Jerusalem area, an ever-expanding concept. I mean, I've never seen such a dynamic municipality as the Greater Jerusalem area. It now, you have to be careful in Vancouver, it may swallow you one day, because every day I hear of another part of the West Bank which is part of the Greater Jerusalem area, so that Israel, that consensus Israel would say, we're not negotiating Greater Jerusalem. So they're expanding it all the time. It already, I think, reaches my hometown in Haifa almost. The other way of creating annexation is by allowing Jewish settlements. This creates a no-go area for Palestinians within the Palestinian areas. Imagine a big prison, and then part of the prison are taken by the wardens, and the prisoners are not allowed to go into it, because that's an ex-territory that belongs to someone else. And what I'm trying to impress upon you, that these were decisions taken already in 1967. So the whole charade of an Israeli society tormented between a group of people that want to give back the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians and allow them to create an independent state, and a group of annexationist Israelis who do not wish to have any peace with the Palestinians, is a fable, is a fabricated narrative. There isn't a genuine debate in Israel about Palestinian nationhood or independence or self-determination. There isn't. There is only a tactical debate on two issues. One is how best to sell to the world the old Zionist wish to have all of Palestine or most of Palestine with as few Palestinians as possible. So that's one debate. What is the best way of doing it? Should we have someone like Feiglin, who is about to visit you in Canada, and who would say to you forward, not one Arab should stay there and we should have all the territory? Or should we have someone nice like Amos Oz or Abi Yehoshua, who would tell us that they are tormented and they're not sure that they want the whole of the territory, and there's a little settler in every Israeli Jew and you have to understand it, and I don't want to. I mean, they do it much better than I do. They're very eloquent. But it's a tactical debate. This is not a genuine debate between one set of values and another set of value. Within the framework of Zionism, you can not, instead of having rainbows and fans, you have pajama stripes. The Israeli political debate is that narrow. But they have an amazing ability of presenting it to all of us as a wide rainbow of ideas. So the first debate is tactical. The second debate is no less important, is the debate about the means of achieving it. Not just how to represent it, but how to do it. How to do it. And the debate of how to do it does not deviate from the basic ethnic conviction that it is totally legitimate and there is no moral problem with a constant open discussion in Israel about what is called the demographic problem. Namely, how many Palestinians can live in a Jewish space. Imagine students, as in my university, former university in Haifa, who sit in the class of a professor called Arnon Sofer, professor of geography. And usually his classes, like all our classes in Haifa, have a large number of Palestinian students in them. Imagine them sitting there and hearing this professor explaining to them that the national security of Israel depends on how many siblings each of their family would have. And if they would have too many children, this is a threat to the national security of Israel. I once asked him, what would you do if you would hear someone in Canada say the same thing about the Jewish citizens of this country? He said, you cannot compare. These are Arabs and these are Jews. These kinds of debates, which seem to an Israeli a very normal debate, are the ones that inform the real discussion in Israel about the fate of the occupied territories. But they are not at all represented in the way that the internal Israeli debate is being commodified and sold to the wider world. Towards the end of my talk, I would try and suggest how to get out of it, because I really think that the few stations I visited tonight, the station of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948, or beginning with the era of direct colonialism before that, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and the very decisive moment when the Israeli political elite made its mind that the occupied Palestinian territories will never be given up and would form part of the state of Israel, while still looking for a future for those Palestinians living in it. I really believe that all these three stations, these three major stations, explain to us why the peace process that bypassed them is not moving anywhere. Because any talk about two-state solution, any talk about a generous Israeli proposal that is not being reciprocated by inflexible, intransigent Palestinian leaders, only validates the Israeli determination to continue with the formula that they have developed in 1948 and still continue to develop in 2008. This allows them to decide, as they have decided in 2000, to divide the West Bank into two parts. One part that they are going to annex, actually they are annexing as we speak, to Israel, and the other, and from any part that they annex, they would eventually cleanse the Palestinians. There's no doubt about it. They would find a way of expelling the Palestinians from any part of the West Bank that they will now annex to Israel, and keeping the rest of the Palestinians in the West Bank in a mega prison that would be subjected to punitive action should it resist the idea of the partition of the West Bank to two parts. And look what happened in the Gaza Strip. The second mega prison surprised the Israelis. The inmates launched missiles against the wardens and the prison authorities. This is something the Israelis cannot tolerate. And therefore the punitive action there are much harsher and more callous than they are in the West Bank. They decided to react to any launch of missiles or any reaction that comes from the Gaza Strip with F-16s and tanks. So it translates, if you accumulate it, it translates into massive killing policy, into genocidal policies. Not because the Israelis want to genocide Palestinians, but because the model that they have built of a mega prison didn't have this dynamic of the prison rebelling as a whole, or having a leadership that says, no way, we don't accept it. You cannot tell the world that because you've taken the settlers out and you have encircled us and you starve us and you strangulate us, you cannot tell us that this is peace. And you were great people, you disengaged, you withdrew, you made the first step towards peace, to the point that Ariel Sharon was considered seriously as a candidate for Nobel Prize in Oslo. You can feel how it would drive mad anyone in Gaza, that this would be celebrated as a peaceful Israel. I mean, I remember the demonstration in Tel Aviv of Peace Now, calling on Sharon to complete the disengagement from Gaza, as if a new era of peace began. Whereas everyone with his eyes in his head understood that Sharon realized that you cannot keep the warden within the prison community, you have to take them out. Otherwise they would be in danger for their life. That's the only thing Sharon did in Gaza. But the PR machinery, of course, celebrated it as another thing. And the result is, of course, that since the people who rebel in Gaza also have beards and look very much like Muslims, that the Israelis even feel that they have even more of a free license to use the most evil kind of, and lethal, not evil, I'm sorry, the most lethal weapons in their arsenal in order to quell the rebellion as they would see it. This is where we are today. This is the reality. It's not the reality of peace. And I think that the way out of it, the way of integrating the historical narrative into the political action of the future, and with this I would come to a closure, is that it's not enough to disseminate the kind of narrative I'm trying to present to you tonight, and challenge the narrative which is hegemonic in the media, in the academia, and in the political system. Of course, this is part of the story. We have to make sure that people know that story. But I think far more important than that, in order to make this narrative stick, in order to include this narrative in the political analysis of the contemporary reality, is to try and convince people to change the dictionary. We are all recipients of the big Israeli laundrette of words. They are masters of it. It's amazing how assassinations are targeted killings and expulsions are relocations. They have an amazing group of people that succeed in presenting the reality exactly the opposite from what it is. But we have to start using different words, different nouns, different phrases in order to get ourselves and others used to a tool of language that would help us to see the reality for what it is, and not to buy anymore the false reality that is being sold to us, and which creates this impossible gap of which I talked in the beginning of my lecture, between the representation and the evidence on the ground. One of the first concepts or words I would like to get rid of, and I'm trying to train myself to do this, is the word conflict. There is no conflict between Israel and Palestine. There is no conflict between occupier and occupied, between colonizer and colonized, between an expeller and expelled. Conflict gives with it, or creates with it, the impression of parity, of equality. People are equally to be blamed. People are equally guilty in their violent reactions, in their lack of progress towards peace, and you start to make everything visible also divisible. That's where the language of partition is far more beyond geography. The language of partition makes it very easy for the people who perpetrate a crime to become victims. Very much like the Austrians succeeded for so many years to portray themselves as the first victims of Nazism, whereas they were the greatest associates of the Nazis. We have to change that language of conflict. And without deteriorating into satanic demonization of anyone, just call the actions on the ground the way they are. When someone occupies, it's an occupation. And then you can explain to people what occupation means. You don't have to use conflict, doesn't explain anything about occupation. There may be a conflict in the municipality of Vancouver about the future ecological policy. But there's no, I don't know, I hope there's no occupation in Vancouver. You don't have a military sergeant who can go through the shopping mall here and destroy every shop whenever he would feel like it. This is occupation. You cannot have in Vancouver a military person going through a school and decide that it's high time to close the school because he didn't like the look on the face of a student that he passed by. This is occupation. This is not a conflict. And you can't see in Vancouver a situation where a military officer would come to a house and would give the people who live in that house 5 minutes to leave it and never come back to it because they need the house for military purposes, or they suspect that in the house there is someone they don't like, or whatever reason. Imagine a system, a lawless system, where the people who represent law and order actually are absolute controller of your life.